Hey guys, today we're talking about one of the weirdest stocks, how paperwork led to a national treasure hunt for something worth millions of dollars, and why diamond hands never fails. This is Moments in Stock History. So, in the 1870s, the hottest startups were railroads. And so some people got together and decided that they were going to try to build something from Texas to San Diego. And as a startup founder would do, they went around and pitched to all these people who they thought could give them money, particularly the government. They said things like, if we don't get to the West Coast, California and Oregon might end up seceding from the Union. And since this was so close to Civil War times, that sort of argument kind of carried a lot of weight. And on the other hand, they pitched the benefits in this utopia that would come from connecting the continent, saying things like, schoolhouses and churches will everywhere adorn infant town and incipient cities, and civilization will take firm and permanent root in what is now wilderness. So people thought that sounded good, and they said, okay, we're going to give you a land grant for up to 5 million acres, contingent on you actually getting this done. So each amount of track you build, you might get more and more. The idea being, as you go and you get this free land, you can sell that off to finance some of the expenses that you have. In addition to that, they issued a bunch of bonds to private citizens that wanted to, get in on the ground floor of this startup. So the Texas Pacific Railroad gets off the ground, they start building. First, they build out to Fort Worth. A couple of years later, Jay Gould gets involved, who's one of the robber barons of the era. Basically, it's super rich guys who always wanted to be involved in the new railroads. They kept building west. They didn't quite make it to California, but they did put in about 700 miles or so, and this entitled them to 3.5 million of the acres of the potential 5 in the land grant that had been offered to them. From that point, their job was, let's get this railroad going and operate it, try to make back the money, start paying some dividends. So the problem was that West Texas at that time was basically brushland, not a lot going on. The idea was that building the railroad out there, right, was going to pop up all these little towns and make it commercially successful so that all of a sudden industry would come to the area. But that wasn't really what happened. Instead, there was droughts, there was floods, and next thing you know, the railroad's going bankrupt. So what do? Well, they're basically out of business, but they've got these bondholders that, want to be made whole, and they've got all this land that they were given. So they tell the bondholders, okay, we're going to put all the land from this Texas Pacific Railroad into a trust called the Texas Pacific Land Trust. You guys are all going to get a piece of this, and we're going to start selling it off, maybe leasing some of it to ranchers who might run some of their livestock through here. And over time, we'll see what you get. You might not get your money back, but it's going to be better than just giving you nothing. So all the original investors are happy, or at least not mad about they're getting something. Some of them decide to just get liquidity out of it, and actually the New York Times has an article in 1904 about how the trust has got this interesting financial engineering, at least for the time, going on, basically share buybacks, where they were buying up land for what probably was much less than it was worth. And people were taking it just so that they could get the cash and be done with the whole thing. And these buybacks is kind of becomes a recurring theme for Texas Pacific Trust over the course of the next 100 or so years. These people probably regret getting out, as we're going to see, because as these ranchers that they were leasing the land to that they weren't selling were trying to figure out a way to make sure that they had enough water for their animals, since that was one of the big issues with the area, is so dry, they would have to dig these wells. And every once in a while, the guys would be digging the wells, and they would realize that there's oil coming into these wells. And pretty quickly, people figured out that ranching wasn't what this land was going to be all about. It was going to be all about, oil or natural gas later on. So in 1921, the first commercial well in the area is drilled and starts producing, and it's basically a straight line up from there in terms of the amount of resources that are coming from under the ground. By the 1970s, the area is producing over 2 million barrels of oil per day and 10 billion cubic feet of natural gas before it starts entering kind of a longer period of decline once all the easy reserves had been tapped into. So all the shareholders probably can't believe their luck. They had this broke railroad that suddenly turned into this massive oil production company. In 1927, everything gets listed on the New York Stock Exchange too. So those guys who maybe sold out because they were looking for their liquidity, now liquidity is not an issue. You can just freely trade whenever you want. The thing is, when I say all these guys couldn't believe their luck, there was at least one person out there who seemed to not know how lucky they actually had been. See, when they did this conversion of the bondholders in the railroad to the shareholders of the trust, they got these certificates that basically was the paperwork that happened to say, okay, now I hold these shares in the trust. Well, all the certificates had been turned in at some point, obviously, because these people, wanted to cash in, or even if they were just going to hold it, wanted to convert to show that they had the more valuable asset. But certificate 390 was missing. At first, this wasn't that big of a deal. Eventually, the trust starts paying dividends, so someone has to start keeping track of where's this money that is owed to someone. There's a mystery person, but we don't know who it is. So that becomes a little bit of an issue. But when the production really starts ramping up and all of a sudden, we're talking millions of dollars, it starts to become a story. People want to know because it's known that this certificate 390 is missing and that they're not going to cancel it and just say like, well, it must have been destroyed. They keep track of all the money that it's owed. Since this stuff is traded on the stock exchange, it's very easy for people to go like, holy cow, whoever finds this 390 is going to be an instant millionaire. The lost certificate at this point is kind of like allowing someone to be the ultimate in diamond hands. I mean, there was a possibility that it wasn't really lost. Someone just had it and was, keeping it in a box somewhere. But it eventually got to the point where if it was the original owner, they basically had to have been dead by that point. The conversion happened in the late 1800s. No one's seen this thing, and we're already in the mid 1900s. So it's not necessarily gone, but it's probably the people, who own it now are the heirs of someone, and they might not really know what they've got. So in the time where the thing is still missing, but people know it's worth a lot, there's a couple claims made by people who say they've got it or they know who has it, that sort of thing. Maybe the sketchiest one is that the brokerage who issued it, so they it had passed through their hands, said, well, that should be ours, and they made a claim to it. Thankfully, they lost. It would be kind of ridiculous. It would be like if you died and if Robinhood just decided those stocks are ours now. There was a more interesting one where there was a guy sentenced to life in Illinois who had studied law in his time there and wrote a brief to the court saying that it was his. And I guess this one got kind of far because somehow his description of what the bond looked like was almost dead on, which seems like it would have been impossible to guess. But one way or another, they didn't end up giving it to him. So then in 1977, the San Francisco Chronicle runs a report that says, hey, the certificate 390 is missing. At this point, this is not the first article of this type. It might be the first article of this type, though, on the West Coast. It's seen by this guy named Edward Munger. Edward works at Wells Fargo as basically an archivist. It was his job to sort through all these papers that had been bought by Wells Fargo from American Express that told kind of the early history of Wells Fargo, since the original entity had been through a bunch of mergers and acquisitions, and somehow American Express ended up owning that and all the paperwork that came with it. And this guy who sorted through, it's reported 4.5 tons of paperwork, remembers seeing certificate 390. he knows where it is, and he goes and gets it. Along with that, there's a bunch of letters, paperwork type stuff that kind of gives the trail of who should be the current owner of the certificate and the wealth that's going to come along with it. As a sidebar, this Edward guy is probably too honest for his own good. If he reads this and he just snatches that certificate out of there, it's probably going to be suspicious that, the guy who works in the archive just randomly is the guy who has this certificate. But there's no way anyone's going to be able to prove that he did, and he's going to say, here's the certificate, ownership is 9/10 of the law. He probably could have cashed this in. So whose was it? Well, that wasn't 100% clear because the provenance, the paperwork that came with it, said that this had been owned by a guy, Joseph S. Decker, and that he had then used it to pay a debt he owed to someone else, last name Delamar. Decker's heirs immediately were like, oh, no, this wasn't payment. He had just pledged this, that if he didn't pay, then Delamar could keep it. Obviously, they were trying whatever they could do to get at this money, but the courts said, no, we're pretty sure that this was just a legit payment, even if it wasn't in full. And so Delamar had the rights to it. By the way, this whole debt that was owed was for $15,000 in the year 1918. So it's not like, these guys weren't both heavy hitters. $15,000 then is worth about $500,000 today. Delamar came from some amount of money. He's born in Amsterdam. His dad's a banker. He then lives a little bit of the storybook life where he strikes it out on his own by stowing away on a boat that's going to the Caribbean just as a teenager. He impresses some people apparently while he's there on the boat and doing whatever he's doing, to the point where he accumulates, prestige, employment, money to go out on his own, and he makes this big fortune, way more than his dad could have given him in the mining industry. So this isn't obviously then a story where, like the one I did on the Fabergé egg, where some country bumpkin ends up with something worth millions of dollars. The Delamar family was loaded and still were. They had the type of money that the house that Delamar had built to live in New York City has its own Wikipedia page. I think it's now at the Poland consulate. Of course, Delamar, who was involved in the original transaction, wasn't living at this time, so they had to figure out, okay, who are his heirs that this certificate is owed to. So in his will, he had left everything to 3 medical schools and his one daughter, Alice. So people go looking for Alice, and she's not too hard to find. Her life has been kind of interesting. When their father died initially, she got $10 million, and there was people writing articles about her, calling her the richest bachelorette in the United States, which was not really something anyone wants written about them in the papers, not particularly Alice, because as it turns out, she wasn't trying to get married to any men anyways. When the newspapers caught up with Alice Delamar and told her about this big windfall, she reacted, I guess, like a person who's had too much money and kind of been burdened by it would, which is contrary to what maybe you or I might do. And the quote that she gives them is just to say, yes, it seems very nice. At that point, she had these nice places where she lived, but ultimately, despite, sometimes hanging out with these artsy celebrities and supporting theater and that sort of thing, she was trying to keep more of a low profile. She, at this point, was 82 years old, so, not only had her father passed, but she was later in her life. So it wasn't like she went out and went on a spending spree anyways. She dies a few years later, and at that point, it all gets liquidated. The value of everything is $5.7 million, which consists of shares in Texas Pacific, which still exists, still buying back some stock, still paying dividends, which at that point was about $800,000, although it was now paying $170,000 per year. And then 50,000 or so shares of Texaco, because Texaco basically had been spun off from Texas Pacific. Now, I'm not going to say here that the lesson is never sell, always diamond hand, but 5.7 million is pretty good return for a guy paying you a certificate that was worth $700-800. But also, man, if that thing had stayed unfound for a couple more decades, it shows the return could have happened again, because in West Texas, where this oil was found, the area is called the Permian Basin. If that rings a bell, that's because that's where the whole fracking revolution has been taking place. So remember when I said production had been basically declining since the 1970s? Well, in 2010 or thereabouts, that totally reversed itself. If you look at a chart of production, and if you look at a chart of Texas Pacific Land Trust, which is still around, it's just a straight up from that point, basically. The fact of Texas Pacific still being around is kind of a joke. I found an article from the Dallas Morning News in the early 2010s, and it was talking about how really the mandate of the trust in the first place was just sell all the land and give all the former bondholders their money back. The quote from the article at the time is, "The mandate of the trustees is to sell the land and repay the shareholders, but there's no mandate for when or how long it will take." So basically they just laugh themselves and go like, well, we're trying, we're just selling, like 10 acres a year. All the meantime, everyone gets rich off these dividends and these oil royalties. Okay, so 7,800 to 5.7 million is pretty good. It's going to be hard to top that, but actually it comes pretty close. The guy who's writing the Dallas Morning News article, and this is only 10 years ago, was saying, oh, this might be a good investment. Shares are at 58. I think they can go to 75. Well, now 10 years later, shares as of yesterday are $1,900 per share, actually coming down a little bit recently from their peak. If you took everything that the certificate represented in terms of ownership, not even counting dividends, you'd have $6 million just from the Texaco piece, which eventually got bought out by Chevron. So that covers the 5.7 to begin with. And then from the actual Texas Pacific, you'd have $190 million. So diamond hands never loses, I guess. And if nothing else, I bet the heirs of the Decker family wish that that guy could have figured out any other way to pay off that original $15,000 he owed to Delamar, because then they'd be the super rich ones instead of this socialite Alice who had no need for the money anyways and had literally political cartoons made of her with her money and a ball and chain. That's basically all we've got on this story. Please like and subscribe and send this to your friends, and let me know in the comments what I can improve about this new format, if this is something I'm going to do going forward, or if we're going to go back to the old stock footage grind. Thanks for watching.